At 60, I believed the ink on my life story had already dried, and the final chapters were meant to be lived out in the quiet of a shared home. I had spent 35 years as the silent anchor of a family, packing away my dreams of botanical research and my laboratory coats to ensure my husband's career never wavered. I was a wife. I was meant to stay a wife. But then, with the indifferent click of a rolling suitcase against the hardwood, Michael walked out, and the rhythm of my entire world was shattered. I was invisible, an aging woman in a simple cardigan, discarded after 3 decades of loyalty. I reminded myself that I was just a ghost in a gray blouse, and David R. Cornell was a man made of ice, immense wealth, and untouchable power. But I didn't know the quiet war he was fighting, or that he hadn't stopped thinking about me since the first night he saw my silhouette reflected in the glass walls of his botanical empire. If you've ever believed it was too late for a second bloom, or that the world had entirely forgotten your value the moment you were left alone, this story might change your mind. The silence of a high-end conservatory at midnight is a heavy, unnatural thing. It doesn't feel peaceful, it feels like a sanctuary waiting to be sealed. For months, that glass vault had been my only refuge. To the wealthy elite, I was not a woman with a history, I was a phantom who smelled of damp earth and fertilizer, a shadow moving among the exotic leaves while they built their fortunes. Back in my youth, I had been someone. 35 years ago, I was a researcher on the verge of discovery. I had stood in laboratories decoding the DNA of rare hybrids, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between a species thriving or disappearing forever. I had led teams. I had published papers. But the universe has a cruel way of resetting your scales, and I had traded my brilliance for the simple, quiet duty of a marriage that ended in a walk toward the door. The house Michael left behind didn't just feel empty, it felt cavernous. A museum of 35 years of shared breaths that had suddenly turned into stale air. Every time Stacey walked past the coat rack where his beige windbreaker used to hang, or the nightstand where his reading glasses once sat, the silence seemed to ring in her ears like a physical blow. The legal papers sat on the kitchen island, their crisp white edges a sharp contrast to the warm oak she had polished every Saturday for 3 decades. She realized then that she couldn't stay within those walls. If she did, she would eventually become part of the furniture, a relic of a marriage that had been summarily decommissioned. She needed a place where things were still growing, somewhere the air was thick and alive instead of thin and haunted. That was how she found herself standing in the humid, glass-domed lobby of the Cornell Conservatory. The hiring manager, a young man with a sharp suit and a distracted gaze, hadn't even looked at her eyes when he saw her application. He saw, early 60s, and homemaker, and nearly tossed the paper aside. But then he saw the opening for the night shift maintenance crew, a position no one wanted, involving the grueling labor of buffing the massive marble walkways and tending to the base-level soil beds while the world slept. "It's hard on the knees, Mrs. Witt," he had said, his voice dripping with a patronizing pity that made Stacey's jaw tighten. "And it's lonely. You'll be essentially invisible to the daytime staff." "Invisible is fine," Stacey had replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her soul. "I've had 35 years of practice." Her first night began at 10 p.m., just as the city outside was beginning to dim its lights. She was handed a faded blue jumpsuit that felt scratchy against her skin and a heavy, industrial floor buffer that looked like a mechanical beast. As she stepped into the great hall, the scent hit her first, the overwhelming, intoxicating aroma of damp earth, blooming jasmine, and ancient ferns. It was the first time in weeks she had taken a breath that didn't feel like it was catching on a shard of glass. She began the work. The floor buffer was a temperamental thing, pulling at her shoulders and vibrating through her arms until her bones ached, but she welcomed the pain. It was a physical weight she could understand, unlike the unseen weight of Michael's indifference. She learned the rhythm of the machine, the way it glided over the marble, erasing the scuffs and footprints of the thousands of wealthy patrons who had wandered through the gardens during the day. She was the shadow that cleaned up after their lives, a phantom moving along the baseboards while the important people slept in their high-rise beds. After the floors were polished to a mirror shine, she moved to the soil. This was where her old life, the life Michael had never really asked about, began to stir. Decades ago, before she was a wife, before she was a support system, she had been a student of the earth. She knew the pH levels of the peat, she knew the subtle difference between a leaf that was thirsty and one that was drowning. As she knelt in the dirt to clear the debris from the base of a towering Peruvian lily, her knees protested. At 60, the damp heat of the conservatory made her joints stiff, and the gray curls at her neck dampened with sweat. But as she ran her fingers through the mulch, she felt a strange, grounding electricity. She wasn't Stacey the abandoned wife here. She wasn't the woman whose husband had traded her in for a fresh start, as if she were a used car. Here, under the vast glass dome that reflected the distant, uncaring stars, she was simply a woman with soil under her fingernails. The conservatory at 2 a.m. was a world of deep greens and shifting shadows. The vault, as the night crew called it, felt like a living lung. Every hiss of the automated misting system sounded like a long, slow exhale. Stacey found herself talking to the plants in low, hushed tones, sharing the secrets she couldn't tell the empty rooms of her house. She told a cluster of orchids about the night Michael hadn't come home for dinner, and she whispered her fears of being forgotten to the ancient, stoic palms. She was buffing the perimeter of the north wing, the steady whir-thump of the machine her only companion, when she felt that strange sensation again, the feeling of being watched. She stopped the machine, the sudden silence rushing into her ears like water. She looked up toward the darkened executive balconies that overlooked the gardens, but there was nothing but the glint of moonlight on glass. Just a ghost, she whispered to herself, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of a gloved hand. She returned to the rhythm of the buffer, her cardigan discarded on her cleaning cart, her simple blouse stained with a streak of dark mud. She was employee number 772, a woman whose name no one in this building bothered to learn. She was trading her grief for the ache in her muscles, and for the first time since the suitcase clicked shut, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, in the dirt, waiting to see if anything in her life could still find the strength to grow. The midnight air in the Cornell Conservatory was thick enough to feel like a second skin, a humid, fragrant weight that usually kept the rest of the world at bay. Stacey was positioned near the glass perimeter of the tropical wing, her industrial floor buffer humming a steady, low-frequency vibration that rattled through her arms and settled deep in her chest. For 3 weeks, this machine had been her only confidant, its mindless, mechanical rhythm providing a necessary sanctuary from the erratic, painful thoughts of her former life. She moved with a practiced, invisible grace, her gray curls tied back, her gaze fixed on the marble floor where the moonlight fractured through the glass dome above. She was deep into the meditative crawl of her shift when she saw it, a flicker of movement in the reflection of the towering glass panels. Usually, the executive level was a graveyard of dark offices and empty hallways by this hour. But tonight, a silhouette stood perfectly still on the polished mezzanine. Stacey didn't stop the buffer immediately. Her muscle memory was too deeply ingrained to break the cycle of her work for a mere shadow. But as she made her turn, she caught the reflection again. It was a man, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored coat that seemed to absorb the dim light around him. He was leaning against the railing, his posture radiating a cold, clinical composure that felt at odds with the wild, sprawling greenery of the gardens below. This was David R. Cornell. She knew the name from the orientation videos and the gold leaf lettering on the lobby walls, but seeing him in the flesh was different. He looked like a man made of ice and untouchable power, a figure carved from the same hard marble she was currently scrubbing. Stacey kept her head down, shrinking into the baseboards as she had been trained to do. She reminded herself that to a man like him, she was just employee number 772, a phantom who smelled of damp soil and industrial soap, a shadow that moved so the executives could build their fortunes in a clean world. She expected him to do what he had done every other night she had caught a glimpse of him, walk past without a second glance, his mind already occupied by the quiet war of venture capital and global legacies. But the rhythm of her invisible life shattered when the sound of the buffer was suddenly punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic click of dress shoes on the stairs. He wasn't walking past. He was descending. Stacee's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt dangerously loud in the cavernous silence of the wing. She reached down and clicked the buffer off. The sudden absence of noise was deafening, leaving only the hiss of the automated misting system and the heavy thrum of her own pulse. She stood there, clutching the handle of the machine, her knuckles turning white as she stared at the floor, waiting for the reprimand or the dismissal she felt was inevitable. The soil in this quadrant is too dry for the Cattleya orchids, a deep, gravelly baritone vibrated through the quiet air. Stacee didn't look up immediately. The automated sensors are set to 60%, sir, she replied softly, her voice steady but barely above a whisper. But the humidity from the vents is stripping the moisture before it hits the roots. I've been supplementing them by hand at 1 a.m. There was a long, unsettling silence. Stacee finally risked a glance upward. David Cornell was standing 5 feet away, his dark eyes locked onto hers with a piercing, unsettling curiosity. He didn't look at her with suspicion or the patronizing pity she had grown used to from the daytime managers. He looked at her as if he were seeing a secret he hadn't expected to find buried in his own empire. "You're not just a cleaner," he said, his voice precise and formal. "A cleaner follows the sensors. A gardener knows the vents are lying." Stacee felt a surge of heat crawl up her neck, a flicker of the woman she had been 35 years ago, the researcher who understood the pulse of the earth. "I am whatever the badge says I am, sir," she whispered, gesturing to the faded blue fabric of her jumpsuit. David took a slow step closer, his presence anchoring the space around them. He looked at her calloused hands, then at the gray curls at her temples, and finally back to her eyes. "I've watched your reflection in the glass for 3 nights, he confessed, his gaze never wavering. "Most people move through this space as if they own it. You move through it as if you're listening to it breathe." For a fleeting second, the vault of the conservatory didn't feel like a place of isolation. It felt like a shared solitude. Stacee realized with a sudden, cold dread that her invisibility was gone. He had truly seen her, and in this world of ice and power, being seen was the most dangerous thing of all. "I have work to finish, Chairman," she said, her voice trembling as she reached for the power switch. "So do I, Stacee," he replied, using her name with a gentle reverence that made her breath catch. As he turned and walked back toward the shadows of the mezzanine, leaving her alone with the humming machine and the scent of damp jasmine, Stacee realized the silence of the conservatory had changed. It no longer felt like a vault waiting to be sealed, it felt like a garden waiting for the light. She had spent 35 years believing her story was over, but as she watched a man made of ice disappear into the dark, she wondered if the world still had room for a second bloom. The humid quiet of the following Tuesday was shattered not by a sound, but by a palpable sense of panic that drifted through the conservatory's vents. Even at midnight, the air felt electric with the kind of corporate anxiety that usually preceded a disaster. Stacee was in the West Wing, buffing the slate floors near the fountain, when she saw a group of men in white lab coats huddled around the glass altar, a climate-controlled hexagonal vault in the center of the room. Inside sat the Aurelia Cornell, a one-of-a-kind hybrid orchid that was the centerpiece of David's global environmental legacy. The lead botanist, a man with frantic eyes and trembling hands, was adjusting a digital monitor while his assistants hovered like nervous birds. The orchid, which should have been a vibrant, pulsing violet, was drooping, its edges curling into a sickly, translucent yellow. To the untrained eye, it was just a dying flower. To the Cornell group, it was a $1 million failure unfolding in real time. The nutrient levels are perfect, the botanist hissed, his voice echoing off the glass. The temperature hasn't fluctuated by 1/10 of a degree. If this plant dies, the chairman will have our heads. Why isn't it responding to the serum? Stacey stayed in the shadows, her floor buffer clicked off. She watched them from behind a thicket of bird of paradise plants, her heart aching for the orchid. She didn't see $1 million, she saw a living thing that was suffocating. She recognized that specific shade of yellow, the way the veins in the leaves were swelling while the tips remained brittle. It wasn't a nutrient problem. It was a vascular rejection of the very mist they were pumping into the vault. When the experts finally retreated to the laboratory to run another round of futile simulations, leaving a lone security guard who soon drifted toward the coffee station, Stacey moved. She didn't think about her badge number or the invisible role she was supposed to play. She stepped into the light of the glass altar, her gray curls illuminated by the violet grow lights. She bypassed the digital keypad, the botanists had left it unlocked in their haste, and stepped into the pressurized chamber. The air inside was sterile and sharp with the scent of synthetic minerals. "You're drowning, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to steady the air. She knelt before the Aurelia. With the precision of the researcher she had been 35 years ago, she reached into her cleaning cart and pulled out a small, specialized kit she had secretly assembled from the nursery's discarded tools. She didn't use the high-tech serums. Instead, she took a sterilized scalpel and made a series of microscopic, diagonal incisions at the base of the stem, the triage of leaves she had perfected in her youth. She was performing a vascular bypass. She carefully drained the excess synthetic fluid that had become a blockage and replaced it with a simple, balanced solution she had mixed herself from rainwater and organic moss. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp with a focused brilliance that Michael had never cared to witness. In this moment, she wasn't a discarded wife or a night shift cleaner. She was a healer, a scientist, and a woman who understood the fragile line between life and the grave. As she worked, the plants seemed to shudder, the leaves losing that brittle tension. She spoke to it, not in the language of data, but in the language of growth and survival. She told the orchid about the resilience of the wildflowers back home, and how sometimes, you have to break a little to bloom again. She finished the procedure, wiped the base of the glass with her lemon-scented rag to hide her footprints, and slipped back into the shadows just as the botanists returned. She went back to her floor buffer, the steady whir of the machine masking the frantic beat of her heart. She didn't notice the silhouette standing on the dark executive balcony high above. David R. Cornell stood with his hands gripped tightly on the railing, his breath hitched in his throat. He had seen everything, the way she moved with the grace of a master, the way her hands had performed a miracle that his $1 million experts couldn't even conceptualize. He watched her return to her invisible work, a woman in a faded blue jumpsuit who had just saved the heart of his empire without asking for a single word of credit. The ice around David's heart didn't just melt, it cracked. He realized then that the phantom he had been watching wasn't just a survivor of a broken marriage. She was a titan, a woman of profound depth who was hiding her light in the dirt. And as the Aurelia Cornell began to pulse with a faint, newfound strength under the violet lights, David knew that the quiet war he had been fighting alone was finally over. He didn't just want to save his plants anymore, he wanted to know the woman who knew how to save them. The following night, the air in the conservatory felt different, less like a weight and more like a held breath. Stacey moved through the fern grotto, the familiar mechanical hum of her floor buffer providing its usual rhythmic comfort, but her eyes kept drifting toward the mezzanine. She felt exposed, the invisible armor she had worn for months now rendered translucent by the chairman's gaze. When the elevator light chimed at 1 a.m., she didn't jump, she simply clicked off the machine and waited in the sudden, ringing silence. A young assistant in a charcoal suit appeared, looking deeply out of place among the damp moss and overhanging vines. He didn't speak with the dismissive tone the daytime staff used. Instead, he bowed slightly. "Mrs. Witt? The chairman is requesting your presence in the upper study. He said to tell you the jasmine is blooming early." Stacey smoothed her faded blue jumpsuit, her hands trembling slightly as she tucked a stray gray curl behind her ear. She felt the absurdity of the moment, a night shift cleaner being summoned to the pinnacle of a billion-dollar empire, but she also felt a strange, quiet dignity. She followed the assistant to the glass elevator, watching the gardens shrink below her until they were nothing but a sea of dark, undulating green. David's office was not the cold, sterile command center she had imagined. It was a cathedral of wood and paper, lit by the warm, amber glow of a few desk lamps. Blueprints were sprawled across a massive oak table, held down by smooth river stones, and the scent of Earl Grey tea cut through the lingering smell of the conservatory's humidity. David was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the door. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked more like an architect's than a financier's. "I didn't expect you to come," he said, turning slowly. He gestured to a leather armchair across from his desk. A porcelain cup was already waiting, steam curling into the air. "Please, Stacey. The floor can wait. The Aurelia orchid is breathing again, and I believe I owe you more than a paycheck." Stacey sat, the luxury of the leather feeling foreign against her work clothes. She took the cup, the warmth of the tea seeping into her stiff joints. "I didn't do it for the chairman," she said softly, meeting his eyes. "I did it because it was dying. I know what it's like to be a living thing that people have stopped looking at correctly." David sat behind the blueprints, a weary, human shadow crossing his face. For the first time, he didn't look like a man made of ice. He looked like a man who was very, very tired. He pushed a set of architectural drawings toward her, plans for a global network of seed banks and restorative forests. "People call these my legacy projects," he whispered. "They think I'm building them to save the world. But the truth is, I'm building them because they are the only things that don't talk back. They don't remind me of the silence in my own house." He looked at her then, a raw, unexpected vulnerability in his gaze. "My wife passed 12 years ago. My children live in 3 different time zones and call on holidays. I built this empire, this vast, glass-enclosed world, so I would never have to sit in a room and hear my own heartbeat. I've spent a decade hiding in the noise of making money." Stacey set her tea down, her heart aching with a sudden, sharp recognition. "I did the opposite," she said, her voice a low anchor in the large room. "I spent 35 years making myself as small as possible so my husband's life could be big. I built an empire of laundry, and home-cooked meals, and perfectly organized closets. I made my home a temple of service so I wouldn't have to face the fact that I had stopped being a person and started being a convenience." When he left, the silence wasn't just in the house, it was in me. They sat in the amber light, a billionaire and a cleaner, realizing they were 2 sides of the same coin. They had both built massive, intricate structures, one of glass and steel, one of sacrifice and duty, not as monuments to their success, but as fortresses against their loneliness. David leaned forward, his hand hovering near the blueprints. "I saw you in the vault last night, Stacey. I saw the way you touched those leaves. You weren't cleaning. You were communicating. I haven't seen that kind of brilliance in years, not even from the PhDs I hire from Europe." He paused, his voice dropping an octave. "Why did you pack that version of yourself away?" "Because Michael didn't need a scientist, Stacey replied, a single tear tracing a path through the faint lines at the corner of her eye. He needed a wife. And I thought being what he needed was the same as being loved. David didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. He simply picked up a river stone and turned it over in his hand. I think we've both spent enough time hiding, don't you? He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping just short of her chair. He didn't reach out to touch her, but the air between them hummed with a new, dangerous electricity. I'm redesigning the expansion for the Soul Research Wing. The experts say the ventilation is perfect. I'd like to know what the woman who talks to orchids thinks of the blueprints. Stacey looked down at the drawings, the complex lines and mathematical notations beginning to make sense to a part of her brain that had been dormant for half a lifetime. She looked at her calloused, soil-stained hands, and then at the man who was offering her a seat at a table she thought was locked away forever. The ventilation is wrong, she said, her voice growing stronger, the scientist finally stepping out of the ghost. If you put the intake there, the ferns will starve by winter. David smiled then, a genuine, crooked smile that transformed his face. Show me, he whispered. As the clock struck 3 a.m., the man made of ice and the invisible gardener leaned over the table together, their heads bowed over the blueprints, the silence of the skyscraper finally feeling like peace instead of a vault. The story of the discarded wife was fading, and in the warm glow of the office, something new was beginning to take root. The peace Stacey had found in the upper study, surrounded by blueprints and the scent of Earl Grey, felt like a fragile bubble that the world was waiting to pop. For 2 weeks, she had lived a double life, a cleaner by night, and a silent consultant by dawn. David had given her a keycard that bypassed the service elevators, a small plastic sliver of autonomy that felt heavier than her entire ring of master keys. But the universe has a way of sniffing out a second bloom and trying to frost it before it can take root. The frost arrived on a Thursday afternoon, a time when Stacey was usually asleep in her small, quiet apartment. The persistent, aggressive knocking on her front door wasn't the rhythmic tap of the mailman or the soft thud of a neighbor. It was a sound she recognized in her very marrow, the demanding, entitled cadence of Michael. When she opened the door, she didn't see the man she had loved for 35 years. She saw a stranger in a casual polo shirt, his face flushed with a mixture of disbelief and a simmering, righteous anger. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the foyer, his eyes scanning the modest space as if looking for the $1,000,000 secret he was convinced she was hiding. I ran into Linda at the grocery store, Stacey, he began, his voice tight and patronizing. She says you're working at the Cornell Conservatory. She says she saw a photo of you in some local business blog, standing next to David Cornell himself. At 3 a.m. Stacey folded her arms, her natural gray curls framing a face that had grown remarkably calm since the night the suitcase left. I have a job, Michael. Something you told me I wasn't capable of finding at my age. Michael let out a short, bark-like laugh, the sound of a man who thought he was delivering a mercy blow. A job? Stacey, you're a janitor. You scrub toilets and polish floors. I know you, and I know how your mind works when you're lonely. You've always had a vivid imagination, but this? This is delusional, even for you. He took a step closer, leaning in with that familiar, father knows best, tilt of his head that used to make her feel so small. I heard the rumors. People are whispering that you're consulting for him. Do you have any idea how pathetic that sounds? David Cornell is a titan. He's a billionaire who operates on a level you can't even spell. He doesn't need a 60-year-old housewife to tell him how to run a conservatory. He's probably just being polite because he feels sorry for the lonely woman cleaning his glass. The words were designed to be thorns, meant to snag on her insecurities and pull her back into the shadow where she belonged. For a second, the old Stacey, the one who equated service with love, wanted to apologize, to shrink, to agree that it was all a big misunderstanding. He's using you for a tax write-off, or worse, he's making you the butt of a joke, Michael continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You're out of your league, Stacey. You're making a fool of yourself, and by extension, you're making a fool of me. People still associate us, you know. I have a reputation to maintain in this town. I won't have my ex-wife becoming a local laughingstock because she thinks she's some kind of botanical genius. Stacey looked at the man who had discarded her like a piece of outdated machinery. She realized then that Michael wasn't afraid she was failing, he was terrified she was succeeding. He didn't want her to be a laughingstock, he wanted her to be the invisible, broken thing he left behind, because that was the only way his fresh start felt justified. I saved his orchid, Michael, she said, her voice a low, steady anchor. The Aurelia. The one his PhDs couldn't fix. I saved it with the skills I had before I ever met you. The skills I put in a box so I could make sure your shirts were ironed and your dinners were hot. Michael's face contorted, a flash of genuine venom crossing his features. You're a cleaner, Stacey. Don't forget that. When the sun comes up and the important people walk through those doors, you're the one hiding in the service closet. Cornell will get bored of his little charity project soon enough, and when he drops you, don't come crawling back to me for a sense of reality. He turned on his heel, his back to her as he walked toward the door, the same back she had watched disappear with a suitcase months ago. But this time, she was about to turn back toward the service elevators when she saw him. Michael was there, standing near the oyster bar, looking remarkably smug in a rented tuxedo. He was talking to a group of local businessmen, his gestures wide and performative. Then, his eyes caught hers through the gap in the door. The smugness vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory gleam. He didn't just see his ex-wife, he saw a target. Michael moved toward the corridor with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for this moment. He intercepted her just as she stepped out into the fringes of the ballroom. Well, look at this, Michael said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a nearby circle of investors. The phantom of the night shift has decided to join the living. Tell me, Stacey, did you bring your mop, or are you just here to make sure the marble is up to your standards? A few people turned, their eyes skimming over Stacey's simple dress and gray hair with a mixture of confusion and mild amusement. Stacey felt the familiar urge to shrink, to apologize for taking up space, to disappear into the baseboards as she had done for 35 years. I'm here because I was invited, Michael, she said, her voice trembling but audible. Invited? Michael laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the soft string quartet music. He turned to the growing crowd of onlookers. My ex-wife here has a bit of a wandering mind. She thinks she's a scientist now. She's been telling people she's consulting for David Cornell. Can you imagine? 35 years of making tuna casseroles, and suddenly she's a botanical genius. It's sad, really. The loneliness does strange things to a woman of a certain age. The whispers started then, the cruel laughter of small-minded people that the competitor's story had warned about. Stacey saw the way they looked at her, not as a person, but as a curiosity, a charity project that had overstayed its welcome. David R. Cornell appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his dark coat making him look like a shadow against the gold-leafed walls. He began to descend, his gaze fixed on the commotion. Michael, seeing the chairman approach, straightened his tie, clearly preparing to rescue the situation by showing David how helpful he was being by managing his delusional employee. Mr. Cornell, Michael called out, his voice oily with false concern. I'm so sorry for the intrusion. My ex-wife here seems to have wandered out of her designated area. I'll make sure she gets back to the service wing before she causes any more embarrassment for your guests. David reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. He didn't look at Michael. He didn't even acknowledge the man's existence. He walked straight to Stacey and stood beside her, his presence an impenetrable wall of ice and power. Is there a problem here, Stacey? David asked, his gravelly baritone silencing the room. Stacey looked at Michael, who was still wearing a pathetic, hopeful grin, and then at David, who was waiting for her to speak. She realized in that moment that they were both trying to define her. Michael wanted her to be a failure, David wanted her to be a miracle. But neither of them was asking who she wanted to be. No, David, Stacey said, and the use of his first name caused a collective gasp to ripple through the ballroom. She took a step back, detaching herself from the orbit of both men. There isn't a problem. There's just a misunderstanding. She turned to Michael, her eyes clear and filled with a quiet, devastating strength. You're right, Michael. I am a woman who spent 35 years making casseroles and folding your shirts. And I was damn good at it. But I was also the woman who saved the orchid you're all standing here to celebrate. I don't need you to tell me I'm delusional, and I don't need David to tell me I'm a genius. She looked at her threadbare cardigan, then at the glittering crowd of people who measured a soul's worth by the labels they wore. She offered them a calm, dignified smile, one that said she finally saw them as clearly as they had pretended to see her. I'm going home now, she said to the room at large. Not because I don't belong here, but because I don't need to be here to know who I am. She turned and walked away. She didn't head for the service stairs, and she didn't head for the executive elevators. She walked straight through the front doors of the conservatory, her heels clicking on the marble with a rhythm that sounded like freedom. She left Michael standing there, a small man in a rented suit, and she left David standing by his orchid, a billionaire who realized he had just lost the only thing in his empire that wasn't for sale. As she stepped out into the cool night air, Stacee B. Witt didn't feel like a phantom or a ghost. She felt like a woman who had finally stopped waiting for the world to notice her and had decided to notice herself instead. The salt air of the small coastal town didn't smell like the sterile, misted humidity of the Cornell Conservatory. It smelled of decay and rebirth, of low tides and the stubborn endurance of the sea. Stacey had returned to the cottage her grandmother had left her, a weathered shingle box sitting on a cliff's edge where the wind never stopped whispering. Here, her gray curls were wild and tangled, no longer tucked under a hairnet or smoothed for a gala. She spent her days in the garden behind the cottage, a plot of land that had been overgrown for decades, digging her fingers into the cool, sandy loam and reclaiming the earth one weed at a time. She was kneeling in the dirt, transplanting a cluster of sea lavender, when the sound of a car engine disturbed the coastal silence. It wasn't the rattling hum of the local mail truck. It was the smooth, electric purr of a vehicle that didn't belong on a gravel road. Stacey didn't stand up. She kept her back turned, her hands steady as she packed the soil around the roots. She knew the rhythm of those footsteps, the precise, deliberate weight of someone who was used to walking on marble but was currently struggling with uneven grass. The soil here is too acidic for lavender, Stacey, a familiar, gravelly baritone said from behind her. You'll need to add lime if you want them to survive the winter. Stacey let out a long, slow breath and finally stood, wiping her soil-stained hands on her apron. David R. Cornell stood at the edge of her garden, looking remarkably out of place in a dark wool coat against the backdrop of the churning Atlantic. He looked tired, not the corporate weariness he usually wore, but a deeper, more human exhaustion. I didn't come here for gardening advice, David, Stacey said, her voice caught between a greeting and a defense. And I didn't come here to give it, he replied, taking a step closer. The wind whipped his hair across his forehead, breaking the man made of ice facade he had maintained for so many years. I came because the conservatory feels like a museum again. The Aurelia is healthy, but the building is dead. It turns out that brilliance is quite loud once it's gone. Stacey looked at him, searching for the pity Michael had promised would be there. She looked for the charity project eyes of a billionaire who had lost his favorite hobby. But David's gaze was raw. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life building a vault only to realize he had accidentally locked himself inside. If you're here to offer me a promotion or a laboratory or a fancy title to fix the PR mess Michael made at the gala, you can save your breath, Stacey said, her quiet strength anchoring her to the cliffside. I'm done being someone's project. I'm done being the miracle that makes a man feel better about his legacy. David stopped just a few feet away. He didn't reach for her. He simply looked at the small, struggling garden and then back at her. I don't care about the legacy, Stacey. I realized after you walked out of that ballroom that I've spent 20 years surrounded by people who understand the price of everything and the value of nothing. My experts can tell me the molecular structure of a leaf, but they don't know why it matters. They don't know that it's a living thing that needs to be heard. He took a deep breath, the salt air filling his lungs. I didn't want a consultant. I didn't want a success story to show off to my board of directors. I wanted a partner. I wanted the woman who looked at a dying plant and saw herself, and had the courage to save it anyway. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. It was her old research journal, the one she had left in his office the night of the gala. I read your notes on the South African succulents. You wrote that some species only bloom when they are pushed to the absolute edge of survival. That the stress of the environment is what triggers the most beautiful colors. He stepped into the dirt of the garden, his expensive shoes sinking into the mud, and handed her the notebook. I'm at the edge, Stacey. I've built an empire of glass, and it's cold. I don't want a charity project. I want the person who understands what actually matters, that life isn't about the shine on the marble, but the strength of the roots. Stacey took the notebook, her thumb brushing against his calloused palm. The silence between them wasn't the heavy, unnatural silence of the skyscraper at 2 a.m. It was the silence of the sea, vast, unpredictable, and full of possibility. I'm 60 years old, David, she whispered, the last of her defenses crumbling in the wind. I've spent my life in the shadows. Then it's time we both stepped into the light, he replied, a faint, genuine smile breaking through the ice. The world thinks we're too old for a new beginning. I think we're finally experienced enough to appreciate one. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the waves in hues of gold and violet, the billionaire and the gardener stood in the middle of a half-weeded plot of land. They weren't chairman and employee, or titan and phantom. They were simply two people who had found each other at the end of a long, lonely road, realizing that the root of the matter wasn't what they had built, but who they had become in the process. The days on the coast began to blend into a rhythm of restoration, but the air still held the lingering vibration of David's presence. A week after his arrival at the cottage, the morning mist was particularly thick, clinging to the shingles like a silver shroud. Stacey was at her small kitchen table, the notebook David had returned to her open to a page of sketched root systems, when a courier arrived. There was no grand gesture, no fleet of black cars, just a single, thick envelope embossed with the Cornell seal and a handwritten note. The world is waiting for a different kind of architect. Inside were the formal papers for the Global Botanical Restoration Initiative. It wasn't a job offer in the traditional sense, it was a blueprint for a legacy. It proposed a network of community-led sanctuaries across 3 continents, focused on indigenous medicinal plants and the preservation of forgotten species. At the very bottom, in the space reserved for the executive director, the line was blank, waiting for a signature that had spent 35 years signing nothing but grocery lists and permission slips. That evening, David returned to the cliffside. He didn't come in a suit, he wore a heavy knit sweater and boots caked in the local silt. They walked along the jagged edge of the bluff, the Atlantic churning below them in a restless symphony of slate and foam. "I looked at the papers, David," Stacey said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "You're asking me to lead a multi-million-dollar global project. I haven't stepped into a boardroom in half a lifetime. I've spent the last few years polishing the floors of your empire, not running it." David stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it in the sterile lights of the conservatory. "I have thousands of people who can manage a budget, Stacey. I have hundreds of scientists who can recite the Latin names of every leaf in that glass house. But I don't have anyone else who understands the soul of the work." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her in the fading light. "I've spent my life accumulating power, thinking it would act as a shield against the cold. But power is a hollow thing. It's a mountain of ice that never melts, no matter how many lights you shine on it. I built the Cornell group to be untouchable, and in the process, I became untouchable myself. I forgot how to feel the dirt. I forgot how to wait for the rain." He reached out, his hand hesitating before gently covering hers on the weathered wooden railing. "I'm not offering you this because I want to help you, or because I want to right the wrongs Michael did. I'm offering it because I need you to rescue me from my own ice. I need the woman who looked at a dying orchid and saw a life worth fighting for. Without that heart, the initiative is just another corporate tax haven. With you, it's a second chance at life, for the world, and for me." Stacey looked out at the horizon, where the gray sea met the gray sky. For so long, she had defined herself by what she had lost, her marriage, her youth, her career. She had seen herself as a phantom, a shadow moving along the baseboards of other people's success. But as she looked at David, a man who had everything and realized he had nothing, she saw a mirror of her own journey. "You're asking me to be visible again," she said, a tremor of realization in her voice. "To step out of the shadows and let the world see the curls, the wrinkles, and the scars." "I'm asking you to lead," David corrected softly. "Because those scars are exactly why people will trust you. You know what it's like to be broken and still find a way to grow." In the quiet of the coastal dusk, the weight of the last 35 years seemed to lift. Stacey realized that her life hadn't ended when Michael walked out with that suitcase, it had simply been cleared of the weeds that were choking her. The silence of her house wasn't a vault, it was a sanctuary where she had gathered her strength. "The South African project," Stacey said, her scientific mind clicking into place with a familiar, long-lost spark. "The irrigation plans are too rigid. We need to follow the natural runoff of the mountains, not fight it." David's face broke into a radiant, boyish grin, the first true light she had seen in the man made of ice. "Then I suppose you'd better pack a bag. We have a lot of mountains to visit." As they walked back toward the cottage, the wind felt less like a threat and more like a push. Stacee B. Witt, the woman who was meant to be invisible, took David's hand. She wasn't trading one man's shadow for another's, she was stepping into a sun she had thought had set forever. Her second bloom wasn't just a happy accident, it was a deliberate act of courage, a refusal to let the final chapters be read in silence. The return to the Cornell Group's headquarters did not feel like a walk through a vault this time, it felt like a homecoming to a world that had finally been forced to change its locks. The morning sun blazed against the glass tower, turning the skyscraper into a pillar of light that dominated the Seoul skyline. Stacey stood in the lobby, the same marble floors she had once buffed to a mirror shine now reflecting a woman who no longer needed to hide in the shadows. She wasn't wearing a faded blue jumpsuit or a threadbare cardigan. She wore a tailored suit of deep forest green, her natural gray curls pinned back with a simple, elegant silver clip. Beside her, David R. Cornell stood with his hands in his pockets, his ice-cold demeanor replaced by a quiet, steady pride. As they ascended in the glass elevator, the gardens below shrank into a vibrant tapestry of life. Stacey watched the levels pass, the maintenance floor where her locker used to be, the conservatory where she had saved the Aurelia, and she felt a profound sense of peace. She was no longer employee 772. She was Stacee B. Witt, the executive director of a global legacy. The boardroom doors swung open to a heavy, expectant silence. The same executives who had once walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture were now seated around the long mahogany table, their faces a mixture of forced neutrality and thinly veiled shock. At the far end of the room, Michael sat in a chair near the back, having been invited as a minor stakeholder to witness the transition. He looked small, his face pale as he stared at the woman he had discarded, unable to reconcile the housewife he knew with the visionary standing at the head of the table. David didn't take his usual seat at the head of the board. Instead, he pulled out the chair for Stacey. "The floor is yours, Director," he said, his gravelly voice anchoring the room. Stacey didn't open a laptop or distribute a glossy slide deck. She placed her weathered research notebook on the table, its ink-stained pages a stark contrast to the digital tablets surrounding it. She looked at the men and women who measured a soul's worth by the labels on their suits, and she offered them a calm, dignified smile. "For 35 years, I believed my value was determined by how well I served the dreams of others," Stacey began, her voice clear and resonant, carrying the strength of the coastal wind. "I was told that at 60, my story was over. I was told that being invisible was my natural state. But the truth is, the darkest parts of our lives are often just the soil we need to grow something greater." She gestured toward the digital screens, which now displayed the maps for the Global Botanical Restoration Initiative, the community-led sanctuaries that would heal the earth by empowering the people who lived upon it. "We are not just building seed banks or laboratories. We are building a future where no one is considered disposable. We are creating a legacy that values the wisdom of the roots as much as the beauty of the bloom." She looked directly at Michael then. She didn't look with anger or a desire for revenge. She looked at him with the pity one feels for someone who has forgotten how to see. "If you had told me a year ago, while I was on my knees scrubbing dirt from these very floors, that my life was just beginning, I wouldn't have believed you. But true resilience does not care about age, or borders, or the cruel laughter of small-minded people. It waits patiently in the dark, ready to bloom the moment you are brave enough to let the light in." The boardroom remained silent, but the weight of it had shifted. It was no longer the silence of a vault, it was the silence of a room that had finally been forced to listen. Michael looked away, unable to meet her gaze, realization finally sinking in that he hadn't just left a wife, he had walked away from a titan. After the meeting, as the sun began to set, painting the executive balcony in hues of gold and violet, Stacey and David stood together, looking out over the city. The Aurelia orchid was blooming in the conservatory below, its vibrant colors a testament to the triage she had performed in the dark. "Are you okay?" David asked softly, his hand finding hers on the railing. "I am perfectly fine," Stacey replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "In fact, I think I'm just getting started." Their partnership shocked the corporate world, but over time, people began to understand. Stacey never wanted the billionaire's wealth, and David never needed more power. What they found in each other was something far rarer, a second chance at life. Together, they built a legacy that reached across continents, proving that the woman everyone once mocked could become the heart of an empire far greater than any built of glass and steel. But here is the real question for you. If you were one of those who saw Stacey in her gray cardigan and walked past without a word, what would you do now, knowing the brilliance that was hidden in the shadows? Would you have the courage to apologize for the silence, or would you hide in the crowd, hoping she didn't remember your face? Tell me in the comments, I read every single one.